Several U.S. companies lift their COVID-19 vaccine mandates now that the virus is no longer a public emergency.
23 News reporter Jim Haggerty sits down with an employment lawyer about whether businesses are legally required to lift their own mandates.
Vaccine mandates were a hot button issue, especially when they were first rolled out. And while there is case law that supports them, one Rockford lawyer says there's no law that requires a company to lift the vaccine edict or require them to rehire workers who refuse to take the shots.
Vaccination mandates that employers had in place during the pandemic were enforceable, were legal, and discipline or even separation from employment that resulted from that was legal.
And that's because the United States was in the midst of a public health emergency. Now that it isn't, businesses are not legally bound to lift mandates or rehire former workers. But companies across the country, including here in the state line, are doing so for a variety of reasons.
A lot of employers have staffing issues and need people, and that's a good source of employees is to ask those individuals to return to the workplace.
The number of people who are now vaccinated or theoretically immune to coronavirus infection is also a factor.
Employers may feel more comfortable inviting those individuals back into their workforce, either because the mandates that they were subject to will be ending, or because their internal policy is one that they now feel comfortable changing.
Some state line residents say, regardless of whether they're legally bound to lift vaccine requirements or call departed workers back, it is in everyone's best interest for them to do so.
I really think that the employers themselves should use some discretion and be considerate to the former employees.
Legal experts say while public employers may keep vaccine mandates in place for now, their long-term power may be in doubt now that the federal government has let the national emergency expire.
Thank you, Jim. And private companies, however, likely have a stronger argument to be able to keep any mandates, especially those in at-will states like Illinois.